Okay, here we are. Now, as promised, Futures Feeling number 4, I can count, number 4, we've got Caitlin and Claire and Amanda here with us. And we've already had individual chats, which I'm assuming most of you have gone and listened to prior to this one. I'm just interested in seeing, well, where are we going? I think you've got a sense, everybody's got a sense now of the backgrounds of Amanda, Caitlin, and Claire. I'm noticing I'm jumbling you up, so I'm going to keep swifting around the names like that. So there's, yeah, just something interesting for me to do, because I actually haven't done an interview quite like this in this format where we're bringing together prior interviews into one. Where are we going? How do we engage the public? How do we activate futures awareness, futures consciousness, not just through some sort of intellectual activity of, oh, here's a futures triangle, let's play with that. Of course you can, and I've done embodied futures triangles and all sorts of stuff. You can do all kinds of stuff with any of these tools. But you guys have developed quite unique, I would say, platforms in a sense for thinking and provoking futures awareness or consciousness in people. You know, Amanda and Claire working on the mini Museum of the Future, which of course riffs off Claire's earlier work, and Caitlin with her Ouija futures and so on. So I'm going to ask Amanda first. Where are your thoughts about all of this, and what are your, I guess, your aspirations? Where would you like to take it? And we'll just see how we go, because of course, as I said, I'm not done one of these before, so we're just going to talk and follow lines of flight. Thank you, Deleuze. Okay, so Amanda, we'll start with you because A comes before C in the alphabet.
Very fair. I'm so excited about this chat. I was lucky enough to attend Caitlin's Ouija Futures session, and of course was part of, was involved in the mini museum. And so it was a really beautiful thing to be able to listen back to Caitlin's reflections when chatting with Marcus. And something that really jumped out at me that I hadn't made sense of at the time, but I think is like this really lovely thread between what we're looking at, is this idea of that we did something first and then we found a story about it. That came really strongly through your chat. And it was interesting to hear you reflect on feeling like you'd done things wrong when you were doing the mini museum, and you made something first and then told the story. But honestly, I would have approached it in the same way. So it's made me think, oh, let's think about direction. But it also sort of made me think again about the experience that I had doing the Ouija Futures session, where in my group, as we were moving the planchette, there was clear responses coming through. It felt if there were binary yes, no questions, we'd get a very clear response in that way, sometimes a maybe. But other questions, we were getting these kind of jumbles of letters and often numbers. And so we went through this process of trying to interpret those. And would it be okay if I shared what came out of
Cool.
that? Yeah. So one of the questions that we asked the board was, what does justice mean to you? And the response was the letter Z, T, E, and the number 3. And so we had lots of responses like this, and we're looking at that and going, okay, well, if we were going to find meaning in this, we've done something, we've moved around, we've made something. How do we find meaning in this? And we started to think about, well, Z is kind of the end letter. It's about endings and things coming to a conclusion. T sort of has this intersection aspect of there might be some choice points.
Mhm.
And the E and the 3 were similar shapes, so were facing one another. And so we ended up being able to come up with quite a profound pledge from what at first glance seemed kind of this jumble of nonsense. And so we swore to recognize what is ending and to help it end well, to recognize this moment of choice, and to turn towards one another to find our way forward. And I think
Beautiful.
looking back at it and considering what we've been working on as well, there's just this real sense of sometimes having patience with things, looking at patterns and trying to find meaning in those lets us find something deeper than if we just sort of went, oh, okay, well, I don't understand that at first glance. How can I actually find meaning in what I've done and what's come out, even if it's not immediately clear?
Mm, mm. That's beautiful. And to me, the rational cognitive linguistic brain won't make anything of those configurations. It requires a metaphorical, open, and slow sort of sensitivity.
Mm.
Caitlin, what do you think about that? You've not had a reflection directly back at you from for the Ouija futures. So, where are you at in processing what Amanda just offered?
Mm. I think it's beautiful. And I think, doing Ouija Futures, having that section where people were interpreting their messages. Um, I was trusting in people's creativity that way.
Mm.
But I think too, like, I think that process is so often the case just for living life. Like things happen and you're like, oh God, like, what does that mean? And where do we take this? Um, and often, and I think this reflects on like my initial response too to doing Mini Museum of the Futures of feeling like, oh, I've got to do it in the right way and have this right process.
Mm.
So often we feel like I need to find what's right or true in order to proceed. Um, but with something like, Mini Museum of the Futures or Ouija Futures, um, when you're looking at things like artworks or jumbles of letters, it's really hard to say that there is anything right or wrong. Actually, I think Claire, you spoke about this a bit in your conversation with Marcus about the way that art, because we accept that it's open to multiple interpretations, it creates that space, that freedom for creativity. And when you have that space, you get less stuck on feeling like you need to be wrong or right, and then you don't
Mm.
end up paralyzed doing nothing. When there's the opportunity to interpret and come up with multiple interpretations, you can, there's an easier time, I think, finding paths forward. And sometimes in those contexts, it's not necessarily, about finding what's right or true, but maybe what's finding useful, right? What smooths the path in whatever direction you'd like to go, even if it's just one step along the path.
Mm.
And if I can add to that, I would I think that like there's a recognition that we're
Louder.
in, huh?
Louder.
Oh,
Shout
I've
it.
never been told to speak up before. Guys, it's amazing. I think there's a recognition that we are in a time where things are changing really rapidly and a lot is changing and it's quite stressful on our nervous systems. And I think that we also know that it's really hard to think about the future when you're stressed, right? Because you kind of just go into this like, what do I need to do to survive and thrive? And I think what's interesting about these invitations of unknowing and creativity is kind of going, play, like doesn't matter. And that I think that that's where we are allowed to let it go and to kind of, I don't know, shrug off some of these dominant narratives of, everything is collapsing around us and actually kind of go a bit deeper, draw deeper connections.
Play is really important because it is open. But it also, there's something that Caitlin was saying that kind of, I'm going play, but you use the word truth a couple of times. So, and so there's play and there's truth. Is it a capital T or a lowercase t? The way we play around with that all the time. And then what is it about the space in between where there's an encounter? Claire, can you perhaps reflect on that kind of triad? So you got play, the encounter, and truth. What's going on in the museum, for instance, or perhaps more broadly, just in your creative futures work in general?
Well, I mean, truth is difficult to reconcile with futures, right? Because there's that famous Marina Gorbis, I think it's Marina Gorbis quote, which is like, there are no facts about the future. Like there is no truth. We don't know, but there is certainly intelligence and coherent logic and these kind of things. And I think that I mean, I guess the thing for me about Museum of Futures and I think also I saw it in Mini Museum of Futures as well, is that when you see all the futures together, all these different ideas that people have, which are not necessarily based in truth, right? Because they're people's preferred futures or not in some cases, but their ideas about futures. What you get to is a different kind of truth. It's a truth about how people generally see things. And to me, that has been the biggest insight and the biggest gift of doing any of these Museum of Futures or mini Museum of Futures is an understanding that when we think about the future, we know that we take dominant narratives and what's out in the culture into our thinking. And a lot of it is has an agenda behind it, whether it's a Silicon Valley tech bros going, our future is AI, or it's government or whatever it is, kind of they're putting forward the futures that they want. And I think it's really easy for us to internalize that and go, well, that's the future we're going to get, this techno-optimistic or pessimistic future.
Yep.
But when truth and encounters and creativity come together, what I see is that those aren't the futures that people want or dream of. In fact, the futures that people want and dream of are much more collaborative, community-based, caring, compassionate, all of these things. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And, you know, what I heard in your thoughts there was that people have a feeling of truth, or there's this thing you might call truthiness. You know, that there is this kind of, there is something there that people emotionally recognize as true. Of course, it has nothing to do with the factualities of truth, or, you know, the demonstrability of truth, but it's performative truth somehow. Amanda, what do you think about that?
As you're talking, I'm thinking about meaning and sort of that meaning making that happens, and that, and I don't know if I'm staring into the void too much with this, but it does make me wonder about whose truth and how, you know, there are so many different ways of knowing, and I think what happens with meaning making is it's true for us and our understanding of what's happening or what we're yearning for. I think there's something really valuable in, well, that's true for me in my experience. And I think that's where I think futures and truth sort of sits, that, you know, if the future is a space of potential, then if we're talking about truth, it's about my projections and what's true for me and what's drawing me forward, what's pushing me away.
So there's truth that might be a kind of, again, an emotional frequency that's calling to us in some way.
Yeah, something about resonance maybe coming up here.
So our preferences, wayfinding compasses or something like that, because you know, the theme of Oceania was wayfinding, and you know, we can approach that in so many different ways. Claire, what are your thoughts on wayfinding? You were at the conference with us, so you heard everybody presenting.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting. To be honest, I hadn't really come across it that much before. And I think it's really interesting. I think it's also a really interesting contrast. I guess I sort of see it as its importance as being a foil to the way that we traditionally do things, where we're like, we have a plan.
Strategic, not wayfinding.
A strategic plan. So I mean, I really like its opposition to the fact that we have a plan, and it kind of saying we can't have a plan. Like, we actually have to adjust and adapt and sense as we go forward.
Yeah. Thank you, Caitlin. How about you? Where are you at with this concept of wayfinding, but also truthiness?
Yeah, I'm kind of in the conversation. I'm kind of picking up on like three kinds of truth, or three ways to think about truth. There's like truth as the goal out there. We got to go out and find it. In the kind of very modernist discovery kind of sense. And then there's like the truth that's already in us that we're seeking to become sensitive to. And then there's the truth that we make together. And actually, when speaking of play, in the discussion as you were talking, I was kind of thinking about like play is the space where we do make some kinds of truth. And what sparked in my memory was actually Graeber and Wengrow's uh, The Dawn of Everything, a new history of humanity, which is a great book. But there's a lovely chapter in there where they talk about the role of, the medieval carnival in the European Middle Ages as like this space of playful experimentation with the social structure.
Yeah.
For like a week, a clown was the king and everyone swapped roles. But an interesting point that Graeber and Wengrow make is that, some people kind of see it as, oh, it's like this playful space where people let off steam. So for the rest of the year, they'll tolerate, the monarchy and the clergy. But there's been instances where the carnival has kind of erupted beyond the boundaries of its week and caused, revolutions in communities.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's exciting about play is the capacity for its boundaries to become porous like that.
I love that. I read the book and I had the same. I love that chapter too. Yeah.
Well, it's a place of, again, using the word encounter and experimentation. Foucault used the word heterotopia. So it's not a utopia or a dystopia. It's some place in between where multiple topos, meaning landscapes or context, exist. And I think that's, in a sense, what they were playing with themselves, not having, I guess, read Foucault on heterotopia, but at the same time, they were acknowledging that open space is key to social creativity, also individual, I think, creativity. So and I have the same experience with the Mini Museum of the Future, was that I sat there and my hands did something, and then I came up with the narrative. Because I think that's really what happens. You have a French Revolution, and people stand around and say, "What happened?" Oh, and then somebody comes, oh, there it is. But they come up with it afterwards. They come up with, oh, it happened because there was a famine and the king was an asshole. Blah blah blah, whatever. So they come up with a hindsight, and that's what historians do. Historians make sense of the random. And, if you're going to be an existentialist, the absurd. We make sense of the absurd. But, however we want to name it, the process, I think, involves happening first. How do we deal with happening first? Amanda, you're an art therapist trained. So what happens when you have happening first? And then how do you navigate that?
So in my practice, I do aim to work happening first. When I'm working with somebody, if I'm sort of doing one-on-one or even with a group, there'll be sort of an invitation, a bit of a prompt, a way into some kind of making. And then I might start asking questions, or we might decide to say, maybe should we talk to the snail and see what the snail has to tell us? There's different things that we can do to start to build out some of that sense making and the meaning making that happens. But I think going process first, doing making first, just doing a thing so that then we've got something to work with or reflect on. It helps separate it out from us, particularly if it's something personal. We're no longer talking about me. We're now talking about this thing over here that I've made, which is part of me, an extension of me, an expression of me, but not me in my entirety. And I also find that it really helps us to express things that we might not yet have the language for. So some of those knowings that haven't quite landed, there's something happening here that I haven't processed enough to be able to, put it up into my, that part of my brain and start to speak about it in a really clear and articulate way so I can be understood. There is something so valuable in expressing in a way that does help you connect with what's here and all its messiness. And then it gives us something we can start to work with and play with and get curious about. I think that's something really interesting for me about this idea of curiosity, of play, is that in play there is an inherent uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen, but it feels safe enough that it's not a threatening uncertainty, that it's this kind of curiosity about, well, what happens next and what if I do this?
I like that. And, that sense of the extended awareness that starts in the body first with the happening. But
Yes.
then, when we were all together at those tables in the conference, it wasn't just that we were doing something else on our own. We were doing it with others, doing it all around us. So there's a collective extended awareness as well. Claire, you must be aware of that when you're running your Museum of the Future, the ones that, let's say the one you took to the US, to Atlanta or wherever it was, and so on. What do you make of that extended awareness? And then, of course, we can go to Caitlin and ask her about ghosts, because the extended awareness also has a multi or layered temporality dimension. But Claire first, please.
Yeah, well, look, I think that my experience is also in the combination of art and futures, in particular futures, because I think that when we think of futures, we think of reports and scenarios and analysis, and we don't necessarily think of art. But I think that art has such a beautiful case for this multiple interpretation that we just talked about. But also, I think there's something cognitively interesting happening, which is because there are no facts about the future, because, we might have stories and we have all these, as we just sort of dominant narratives, but they're kind of a bit amorphous. So when you have an object and you say this is from the future, even if it's a plasticine snail in a matchbox, I think it kind of does something to the way our brain processes that. So we kind of take it on as a little bit more than just an idea. We kind of like, oh, this is a future that kind of has happened because here is the evidence of it. And I think there's something interesting in that for me, and I bang on about this probably a little bit too much, but I think there's something really interesting when we understand just how our brain works and how what is top of mind is what we go out and see in the world. In that, when we've looked at the snail of time, did I get that right? No, whatever.
Something like that. Yeah,
Something like that.
Universal snail.
Slow futures. That's what it was.
Slow futures. So when we've heard the story and the idea of slow futures, and then we've also connected it with this object that's from that future. I don't have any evidence to prove this, but my gut says that when we go out into the world, that idea of slow futures is top of mind for a while. And so we might see things that will lead to that or could catalyze that or are being influenced by that idea out in reality. And that to me is one of the biggest reasons why art and futures are important to do together.
Yeah, that's great. And, what do ghosts have to do with art and futures, Caitlin?
What do ghosts have to do with it? Yeah, my little Ouija Futures workshop started with my reading of Derrida, Spectres of Marx, which is it's a bit much post-structuralist French theory, but he talks about he locates ghosts in both the past and the future, because ghosts are things we get from the past, they're things we inherit from the past. Yeah. But when you're getting haunted, a haunting is the promise or threat that the ghost is coming back. It's going to return in the future. So ghosts are these elements of the past that promise to return, sometimes repeatedly, into our futures. And he was really interested in how we interact with these ghosts. So how do we commune with them in a way where we aren't just replicating the past, where we're responding creatively so that when they return in future hauntings, they show up differently and create different possibilities.
Can I connect something here, which is just really interesting? So I went to a workshop that Will Hartigan did as part of the Futures Hub at ANU, and he used the word ghost futures. And it's really funny because I had kind of used the word in my mind default futures, like this or used futures, but I think the ghost is actually really interesting because of that point, that it hangs around, it haunts until its business is resolved, kind
Yeah.
of.
Mm.
That's
No.
fabulous. Can you expand on that ghost futures concept? Because to me, that's really interesting because of my own work on navigating the ruins of the future. For
Mm.
instance, that we are haunted by the implications of our actions. You know, do we ever sit down and look at children in the year 2250 in our imaginations standing there before us? Are they wraith-like, or are they concrete, or are they accusing or appreciative?
Mm.
That sort of thing. I play with that, so I'm really interested in it a bit more, Claire, please.
Well,
If you can.
I don't have my notes, and I don't want to represent Will's ideas wrong, but from my understanding and from my interpretation and how I talk about like kind of default futures,
Yep.
they're those futures where the assumptions behind them remain unquestioned.
Yep.
Mm.
You
Okay.
know, like like we live in a society where we can argue that economic narratives are really dominant.
Yep.
A business is not going to succeed unless it drives profit.
Yep.
But if we question those assumptions, we can kind of go, well, hang on a minute, there's actually quite a lot of businesses that have a need that don't do that. Do you know what I mean? Like there's sort of these assumptions that kind of get folded into this is just the way the world works,
Okay.
where
Okay.
you're
I
like,
see.
oh, not always.
Yeah. So
Mm.
so what it is actually it is a ghost from the past in the sense that we've inherited a model of rational process, progress, and all that. So I'm seeing that. Okay, that's cool. Amanda, you want to riff off that?
Yeah, I do.
I thought so.
I When I first went to join the Ouija Future session, it was because I was really interested in this idea of, I thought this idea of ghosts and specters was kind of a nice analogy for trauma as well, that there's sort of this sense of the things that stay with us, the things that haunt us. And as I'm listening here, I'm thinking also about, you know, there's a therapy modality called internal family systems where you think about different parts of you that might have different needs and they're taking different roles. All of them care about you and are doing their best, but they might be doing a bit of haunting, causing a bit of challenge in what we're doing from a protective place. And so I got listening to this and thinking about hauntings and about how our own traumas, but also the, cultural uh, legacy pieces that like to hang around. What would happen if we started thinking about them as having deep care for us and that there's something they're trying to say? If we think about hauntings, they, traditionally, I suppose, sort of end by, there is a need that has not been met. And so this haunting is continuing to get attention for what is needed. And I'm thinking now also about the reading of Hospicing Modernity and how, yeah, maybe there's something in this about how do we communicate with what's haunting us so that we can understand what it needs so that it can find peace and let go.
Hmm.
Yeah, and then
That's
something
very
new can
interesting.
emerge. Sorry,
Go
go on.
on, Caitlin. No, no, please take the lead.
Oh, I was just saying, and then something new can emerge, right?
Yeah.
Mm.
But until that need, that desperate need for attention is met, we can't hear what is waiting to come through.
Yeah,
Hmm.
and look, from a anecdotal perspective, what I'm finding running workshops and futures-based networks is that people are coming to sessions and kind of being like, how do we think about the future when I've got all this pain in my chest?
Yeah.
When I am scared and I am uncertain, and it's sort of, I think sometimes it's easier and more natural for our brain to fall into certainty and to just be like, it's collapse, everything is bad and it's not going to get better. But I think that I don't know, I actually think that part of our role now as futures people, and especially I guess people who are really interested in feeling of futures, is to help people understand their pain and to
Yeah.
kind of go, there are reasons why you are feeling this, and some of them are really valid and really right. And some of them are also because we have these dominant narratives that have not been questioned. And we have these ideas of how people are and how our society must be run that haven't been questioned. And look, just to bring the C word into something, which I do all the time, is that like capitalism has really stopped our process of social innovation and our social organization. When we were talking about the jester and the time of the fools, I feel like we don't get to experiment with how we run society anymore because there are these behemoth organizations that don't allow that. So I think that, yeah, there's something kind of interesting in acknowledging pain, holding people's hands with the pain, but going, you don't have to carry all that pain, because while some of it might be true, other bits of it are being given to you. The
If I
benefit.
could, if I can add one little thing, that's given me some insight about the flip side of haunting. So haunting is where our ghosts are seeking something from us. I think there's also a big piece in here about grieving futures that we hoped for, that we cared about, that may not come to pass. I think there's a big piece of grief in this as well.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a certitude that we had, perhaps as young people, we were given it, that we were secure, that there is a level of control we can exert in our lives and so on. That's all really important. And I waved this book at Caitlin this morning.
Is that Joanna?
Macy, Joanna.
Yeah.
So, I mean, she does a lot of grief work in her processes. Well, she did. She's no longer with us, of course. But, you know, the point is that we need to understand, don't we, that we hold it in the body, which again takes us back to that body stuff that we've tried to sort of put our finger on in some way.
Yeah.
And that to me is something that we, as a society, don't necessarily handle very well. Okay, like capitalism, it privileges the cognitive, the managerial, and so on. But the thing about creativity, whether it's the Ouija or the Museum of the Futures, the object from the future and stuff, it opens up something. It's a natural ability that we have. We naturally. We're always in the company of ghosts, whether it's thinking about grandma or mum and dad or whatever. But, you know, we hang out in spaces that we don't see, but are actually there. So let's say Ben Okri, in his book, The Famished Road, has people carrying ghosts on their back and they manipulate them to do certain things. We don't know that they're there, or the characters don't know they're there. And that's one way of looking at it. And there's another beautiful book, a book for young children called Ophi's Ghosts, which was written by Justina Ireland, won a Newbery Award in the US for, you know, best young adult fiction. But she has ghosts going around and doing that kind of stuff. But she has a few individuals who come from ethnic backgrounds where they can see the ghosts and you can actually interact with them. So it's something I feel about, it would be great to be able to say, as a futurist, you can put on, I can see the ghost glasses or something like that. You know, you go in. Have you ever played with glasses, Claire, in your kind of embodied stuff? You know,
no. But I find that really interesting, and I think your comment on like people from other cultures seeing ghosts is really interesting, because I think whenever we travel, it's when I often find like my dominant narratives for like how I expect things to be organized are challenged. I'm like, oh, what?
yes.
Everybody doesn't do it like we do. And I think that really opens you up. But I think that's the gift of people who are coming in who might not be part of dominant culture. I also argue this for young people as well, that the actual real value of young people is the fact that these dominant narratives might not have kind of got into their heads too far. Still be able to question them and their logic.
So there's still hope. Is there hope? Do we have hope? How do we foster hope? What does hope mean, Amanda, for you?
I will say that hope is very hard to kill. It does always somehow crawl back, even when you think you've...
Yeah, I hope those guys up in the Behemoth are going to fix everything for us.
Yeah, I think hope for me, Hope is one of the first framings that I was taught about futures through. That was part of my foundational introduction to futures from Peter Hayward. But so I take the sort of classic Snyder approach to hope, which is hope is about agency and pathways. So we can have hope even in really shitty circumstances, even when we're not really clear about about how we get ourselves out of this mess. But there's a sense that if we focus on what we can do, what are the small moves we can make, and how can we look for the next step. It might not be a fully set out plan, but how do we feel our ways forward around that?
Nice, yeah. So in a sense, hope requires us to be brave, but also trusting. Maybe there's risk in hope. Would I be right there, Caitlin? You're nodding your head. Do you want to add more, Amanda, before we pass to Caitlin? Or
I'm happy to pass.
Yep.
Yeah, I think when I think about hope, especially in the context of futures, though I suppose all hope is oriented towards the futures. I think hope is like it can be a small hook upon which you can hang a whole world. Like it doesn't have to be a big thing. Yeah, I'm thinking of contexts where you hear about, people who are like prisoners of war, and they find ways to have small acts of resistance in the context of a cell, or people who live in anyone in very difficult circumstances who find some capacity to have joy in their day, right? So I think often when we think about like hopeful futures, it's like, oh man, how are we going to undo capitalism and modernity and all of these big things which are wreaking havoc on the planet? And that's important, an important project to walk towards. And something that can happen accumulatively. So a lot of little small actions can add up to something big over time. But I think in the context of like an individual life, day to day, small, like hope can be, seeing a bird that you love outside the window, or knowing that your cat will greet you in the morning. And I think that's what's really nice about hope is that it can be small. It can fit in a matchbox, right?
Nice. That's very poetic. It's good. But that's so interesting, because if I think about it, hope also is related to memory. How do we remember things? So the museum, of course, is a receptacle of memory. Have you thought about the cultural space that museums hold, Claire, when you were first setting this up? Have you gone down that rabbit hole? Because it's a really interesting one, isn't it?
Yes. And
yes
yes. It's super interesting. And I think that I wish I had my notes because I can't remember his name, but there was a book written in like 1890 called The Museum of the Future or something. And it was a
really?
museum, guy who was writing this about museums not being these static places, but being nurseries of ideas. And I got very taken with that. And was like, yeah, that's what a museum of future should be. It's a nursery of ideas. It's where we get to place these ideas and kind of go, what do you think? And do we want to play with them? But I want to kind of circle back a little bit to hope, because I think there's something interesting there. Because I think that hope is a belief that things will change, right? And that they will change for the better. And I think that we are naive if we think things won't change, right? That's the one thing that we know, that they're always changing. And I think we can also recognize our naivety in not being able to recognize when things are changing. And Caitlin just gave a good example, and the kind of metaphor for change that sort of appeared in my brain was autumn, right? It's sort of autumn. You don't kind of just wake up one day and it's like, oh, it's autumn. It's sort of trees change, different contexts, in different contexts, and they change, and then suddenly you're kind of like, oh wow, it's here. Like it's kind of, and I think that is how quite a lot of change happens, is that when you're in it, it doesn't feel like you're making any progress or things are really moving, but they are. And it's only because you're a leaf on one tree and there might only be a few leaves, but you can't see beyond your boundaries. And I think that, I don't know, I always like to share that analogy because I think sometimes when we're in transformation, it feels hopeless right at that moment, you know. When you're having a baby, they call it transition. When you're like, I can't do this anymore, and then the baby is born, right? And I think that is actually quite an apt metaphor that I think we could be in. I like to think so anyway, that it feels like it's overwhelming. It feels like we're not going to solve it. It feels like we all want to throw our hands up collectively and say, we can't do this anymore. But that's because the new world is about to be born. I think that's exciting.
It's beautiful, beautiful. I love that baby analogy. But you know, I mean, you all know I'm a nerd. But the other day I was sitting around on the weekend, I think, and I was thinking about good old Heraclitus and Parmenides. Okay, you know, so what do those guys have to say? Well, Heraclitus was the guy who said you put your foot in the river, but it's never the same river. So everything is changing. But Parmenides said, no, everything is unchanging. You see, and both are right.
Yeah.
Because, you know, there are aspects of our speciesness that are unchanging. And yet everything is changing. So somehow you could get all sort of cosmic about it as well. But to me, there is sometimes a place like a museum where you can hold both.
Yeah.
I think that's something that is very attractive about a space like as soon as you called it the Museum of the Future, you know, something you set up a boundary, a space, you set up a cultural space, and so on. And then along comes Caitlin with a Ouija board, another boundary, another cultural space. Okay. So, and then Amanda, it was genius to supply the matchboxes, you know, because they're another space. And I'd like to think, because I'm aware of time and where we're at in this conversation. So I'd like, maybe, could we reflect on space and spatiality and change and permanence, impermanence, permanence? Could we have a quick reflection on that before we wrap up? And I'm sure people will want us back. I'm sure expecting to get heaps of emails to say, get these guys back because they were just awesome. And, you know, we'll see what happens in that space too. But you can kick it off. Whoever wants to go first.
Can I go really quickly? I just feel like I've got something succinct to say, which is, so through the work at Taxi, I really believe and really hope that we can create a space for civic imagination and civic futures thinking where we get used to coming together and dreaming. Like imagine if every museum everywhere had a little wing that was the futures part, where there was an invitation, and whether you did it through a Ouija board or a matchbox or whatever, but there was an invitation to come together with other people in your area and to imagine futures and to have those communicated to decision makers. Like what a opportunity for hope and change.
That's brilliant. And send me in an email the Taxi website. I'll put it at the end of this thing, okay? So that's great. Yes, so a space that actually holds civic potential.
I might jump on the back of that. I think for me, there's something about that we need space and spaciousness to be able to actually engage with what's happening inside us, as well as what futures we might be desiring, what wise ancestors might be asking of us. I think that spaciousness is really important, and I think that the future that we're being sold is one where we don't have a lot of room for spaciousness or thought. And I think that's something worth fighting for. And I'd be really interested in looking at how we could riff on Caitlin's ideas around inheritances and that suggestion you had, Marcus, of someone else speaking about a future that they'd created. I think there could be something really interesting in, this is my story and this is how I feel about this, but now I've inherited a future for someone else. How do I make sense of that?
Exactly. I think that's fantastic. You know, I've often equipped that it would be great to go to a conference where we all send in our, PowerPoint stacks beforehand, but then you have to talk to somebody else's.
Yes.
I would love that so much. It would be such a blast. Get them all mixed up. You know, the way that you've got somebody behind it. Anyway, that's just a funny thought. One I'd love to have a crack at. Caitlin.
Yeah, when I used to play in a jazz band, we used to do a spoof number where we'd all swap instruments. The chaos that would ensue, but it was always fun. In terms of space, I think when we pair like space with something like the museum, I think there's actually something really magical that happens there. I remember I was reading an interview recently in it's the second volume of Choreography is Conditioning, Voicing the Future,
Yes.
which is a book I delivered to Marcus. And there's an interview with someone who works in a museum, and they talk about the process by which museum pieces and art pieces become art pieces and museum pieces. And he's like, oh, when they arrive in a big crate in a truck, they're not art yet. And then when I'm unboxing them and I put on my white gloves, they're not art yet. But the second they hit the wall, there's this magical transformative power of the museum as space that makes art happen. And I think in terms of futures, it's like, all right, cool. What kind of spaces can we facilitate to make futures happen in that same magical way that we see in museums and galleries?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a beautiful, and the word magical is really important because, my idea of this futures sanctuary, a safe place to do futures work that isn't actually tangible, though we can make sanctuaries, but that it's a space of becoming, and also a space where alternatives flourish. So those little ghosts, there are alternative ghosts around. Australia, we're surrounded by Indigenous ghosts that are whispering to us. If only we would listen, if only we could pay attention. Attention, eh? That's been great. Absolutely great conversation. Anything you want to add? Anybody want to add anything? Shall we do this again in a few months' time and just see what's emerged? Or maybe not. We'll just see. Maybe this is the space and it's over.
We'll wayfind it.
Nice.
Out we go. So I want to thank you all then. It's just been terrific, and I'm looking forward to, I think we can all share this through our networks, but to hear the responses. If you've dropped the names of a few books, Caitlin, send them to me. Amanda, anything that you want to send, and so on. Same for you, Claire. Yep. I'll put up a couple of books, the Joanna Macy one. I'll just put them all at the end of this. So thank you so much, and have a good future rest of the day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.